When I began working at Peers Victoria Resources Society, I knew very little about sex work, I knew very little about sex workers, and I knew very little about the kinds of resources or supports that sex workers might need in our community. Through my time there, though, I've had an opportunity and a privilege to learn from the people that we serve, from the expertise on our staff, and from the academic researchers on our board of directors. And I'd like to share some of that learning with you this evening, conscious that I can only really offer a very narrow window into a really complex and diverse reality that is the sex industry in Canada. Oh, pardon me. Because I'm speaking on behalf of other people's experiences, it's important to me to begin with those voices. So I'd like to open with a couple of poems. The first one is from Haley, and she's a graduate of one of the programs at Peers. Her poem is called The Moral of the Story. I am what I am, a surprise, a mistake, a failed IUD, a child brought to my family to bring it together. I come from Vikings. You have Viking in your blood, drool daddy's drunken lips. Listen, don't speak. I am not one who could pillage or rape, but I have seen. And I have seen that we are all trying to be better than those before us. And this is a poem by another one of our graduates, Jamie, and her poem is called Wounds. I stand naked, looking in the mirror, and what do I see? Not the flawless woman I so yearn to be, but a damaged girl, permanently scared, scarred from unwanted abuse that will not fade, no matter what I do. Every time I look, I am reminded of where and from whom they came. I have stopped trying to change. I have stopped trying to cover or erase these scars. I've stopped explaining these dark wounds. These are my tattoos. So you must be wondering, what is Peers? What do we do that this kind of beautiful and profound poetry would emerge from the people that we serve? Peers is an agency that's a registered charity. We provide peer-to-peer resources and supports for sex workers. We've been around for about 20 years. And Peers was founded by former sex workers along with community allies. We're dedicated to providing education and resources and supports for current and former sex workers through our drop-in and street outreach programs. And our programs are tailored specifically to provide education, safety, health, trauma and addictions recovery, housing, food security, crisis response, and very importantly, liaison supports with the police after an assault has happened. We are an essential gateway to other services in the wider community. And in fact, our work has been recognized as so critically important in the community that we received a provincial award from the Ministry of Justice in 2013 for excellence in community safety and crime prevention. We serve about 500 people in our community every year, and the group that we serve tends to be the most stereotyped group of sex workers. The research shows that the sex workers who are involved in survival, what might be labeled survival sex work or street-level sex work, are actually the smallest population of sex workers in the community, but they face the largest experience of violence, the greatest experience of violence. This population makes up about 20% of the total sex work population, and at 500, that's who we serve, we can extrapolate to make a conservative estimate of about 2,000 sex workers in the Greater Victoria area. I would say that that's low. We're a vacation destination. We're a retirement mecca. There's a naval base here. And we're a cruise ship terminal, bringing several thousand new people into our port every single week all summer. So this is a fairly significant socioeconomic group in the community. And if we just very conservatively, just to get an idea of what the scope of this socioeconomic impact is, if we imagine that each individual sex worker at 2,000 sex workers has 10 clients each year, 10 individual people that are her customers each year, we're immediately looking at about 20,000 customers of sex workers in our region. And, you know, I think that those are big numbers and they don't really mean anything until we put them into context. So let me compare that with another socioeconomic powerhouse in the Greater Victoria area. The University of Victoria happens to employ just over 2,000 administration staff, professionals, and support workers on campus, in addition to the teaching staff. And the University of Victoria happens to serve just over 20,000 students who are the customers of that support team. UVic, unlike the sex trade industry, is considered one of the best employers in British Columbia. Employees at UVic can count on not only the labor laws being respected, but they can count on their employer's commitment to positive, equitable, and safe work environments. And they can count on recourse in the event that those promises aren't kept. The whole community has a vested interest in safety and health on the University of campus for its staff and for its students. It would be considered crazy and foolish to deny human rights or constitutional rights for one group of people. For example, the 2,000 staff members I've just been talking about, to deny them their human rights at UVic. It's unthinkable. We would never create laws that targeted the support staff on UVic, on the University of Victoria campus, that target them and make it criminal to, for example, communicate with students for the purposes of doing their legal job. So we would never make that criminal for a counselor or a medical doctor or the person serving lunch, that it would be criminal for them to do their legal work, to communicate for the purposes of that. We wouldn't make it criminal for one of the support staff at UVic to be found on campus. That would make it really hard to get that legal work done if it was criminal to be on the site of your work. And we would never make it criminal for staff, those 2,000 people doing their legal job on campus, to hire assistants like a courier to carry something across campus or a temporary worker to assist with a job. And we would never make it criminal for them to support their families on the avails of their work. However, those laws do exist in Canada. They do target a specific group of people doing legal work in Canada. They target sex workers. And those laws, due to a Supreme Court ruling just before Christmas, are about to be restructured. So I encourage you to look at some of the discussion on the news and online around that Supreme Court decision related to Canadian prostitution laws. I want to be really clear that I'm talking about consenting adults engaged in legal work in Canada. I'm not talking about child exploitation. There are child protection laws for that. Child exploitation must be stopped and children must be protected. We're not talking about child exploitation. We're also not talking about trafficking or exploitation of adults. Labor laws and anti-trafficking laws protect people against those things, and they should. Nobody should be exploited for any kind of work. Nobody should be exploited, sexually or otherwise, to benefit someone else economically. We have to take action on any exploitation in Canada. We're talking about consenting adults engaged in legal work. And some people might say, I don't really like sex work. I don't like the idea of it. I think it's not feminist, or it's not good, or it's somehow inherently harmful to people. This isn't a question about whether or not we like sex work. This is a question about whether or not we value human rights and personhood before the Canadian Constitution. That's a different question. So who are the sex workers? Who are the people who we're talking about here? The current research, and there's a fabulous resource called Understanding Sex Work that's a national research project taking place through the Center for Addictions Research at the University of Victoria. And that research is showing, and other research is showing, that the industry, the sex work industry, is incredibly complex, that is really diverse, and that it defies categorization. There are many reasons people engage in sex work, from a person believing it's their vocation and that it's a way to contribute to health and wellness in the wider community, to people who engage in sex work out of desperation. The primary reason people engage in sex work, it's economic. And that's the primary reason people engage in any labor activity in Canada. About 80% of Canadian sex workers are women, or women identified. 16 to 20% are male or male identified. And 2 to 4% are transgendered folk. And most of the research to date indicates that the average age of sex workers in Canada is 30. There's also some interesting research that compares the backgrounds of sex workers with the backgrounds of people who work in hair salons and people who are waitresses and wait staff. And that research finds that the personal familial backgrounds of sex workers are not significantly different from people involved in other service industries in the community. There are some differences, but they aren't substantially significant. It is important to note that Indigenous people, Métis, First Nations, and Inuit people are incredibly overrepresented among the sex work population, whether it's out on the street or indoors. To give you an idea of that overrepresentation, in the downtown east side of Vancouver, 52% of the sex workers are Indigenous people, and only 2% of the population of Vancouver is Indigenous. Indigenous women who are involved in sex work are 4 to 6 times more likely, recognizing that sex workers in the first place are many, many times more likely to be harmed than the average person. Indigenous women involved in sex work are 4 to 6 times more likely to be assaulted, murdered, or disappeared. And in Canada, we currently have a count of over 800 Indigenous women who have been disappeared, and yet to see an inquiry into that travesty. Tackling stigma and slut-shaming around sex work is really critically important because it impacts all aspects of the sex industry. So if you think about it, the stigma or the judgment or somebody's repulsion or disgust about sex work, that's going to affect the laws and how they're made. It's going to affect regulations. It's going to affect how police enact those laws. It's going to affect the reasons why some people have poorer health than other people who are involved in sex work, or why some sex workers have poorer health than the general population. And neuroscience tells us that social alienation and stigma and shunning have significant negative physical and social effects on people. It's a long, slow death if you're alienated or shunned in your community. Stigma affects the quality of care people experience from landlords, from police, doctors, nurses, social welfare agents, managers, people purchasing sex, friends, family, and romantic partners. And that range, when we talk about it affecting the quality of care, the range of care can span from basic discourtesy through to disgust, to the denial of care completely for a service that the rest of us take for granted, to even exploitation. Once somebody's been outed as a sex worker, there are some people who will abuse their positions of power and authority to exploit that sex worker and require a trade of sex for a service that the rest of us expect with courtesy and without that kind of trade attached to it. There are many exceptional social service providers and police and medical professionals in our community, but there, in every group, are often a few who will take advantage of their power. And the stigma associated with sex work creates a kind of perfect storm where a predator who's looking for somebody they can target will look for somebody whose stigma, could be sex work combined with other kinds of social stigmas, will prevent that person from speaking out and advocating for themselves. Or perhaps that person will have a fear of police because of their own experiences and won't go to the proper authorities to report harm. So this really highlights the necessity for agencies like peers, for peer-to-peer support agencies like us and like our sister agencies across the country. We provide sanctuary in our community for people who often feel judged everywhere they go. We build trust and we increase accessibility for people who don't trust that they can access other services. We help build those bridges and make sure that that can happen. We liaise between sex work and police, as I mentioned before, and that increases safety for sex workers, but it also increases safety for the whole community. Predators aren't fussy about who they commit violence against. Sex workers happen to be vulnerable because of the stigma and the social alienation being relegated to industrial corners of cities all over the world. That makes sex workers a more vulnerable population. The sex work itself, the research is showing, isn't actually where the violence is predominantly experienced. It's predominantly experienced from people who pretend to be customers and then use that, for example, the communication law, which means a sex worker can't have a conversation before he or she gets into a car. That person gets into the car, the electric locks go down, and the person who wants to commit violence takes advantage of the stigma and the isolation to do anything from robbery to assault to murder. And we have an example of that in Vancouver, where Pickton was allowed to hunt human beings in the downtown east side of Vancouver for 10 years because of stigma, because we were afraid to stand up and say that every human being in our community deserves the same human rights. The mass media would have us believe that sex workers are vectors of disease and violence. And I'll tell you right now, that is a false and incredibly dangerous idea. It's an idea that perpetuates stigma, and it's an idea that sets up the environment for harm. Further, it denies the reality of things like the fact that sex workers have a lower instance of sexually transmitted infections than the general population, or the fact that sex workers are much more rigorous in their application of safe sex practices than the general population. So this mass media stereotype really not only denies that, it covers over the reality that there are problems in the wider community we're not willing to look at and that we scapegoat onto sex workers. And I would like to challenge us to think even more deeply about this, that perhaps sex workers are uniquely positioned socially and professionally to increase community safety. Perhaps sex workers are uniquely positioned socially and professionally to engage in prevention education practices around a wide range of wellness issues in our community. Our tolerance of the stigma and violence against sex workers mirrors our tolerance of violence and shaming against women and sexually marginalized groups. And the message of this violence serves as a threat to every person about what will happen to them if they step outside the norm, or if they too try to exercise full sovereignty over their own bodies or over their own sexuality, or if someone even appears to exercise that kind of full sovereignty. The threat of violence stands as a very clear caution against that kind of thing. Stopping sexualized violence in our communities is intimately linked to stopping violence against sex workers, and it begins with affording dignity and the same human rights and personhood that are enjoyed by the rest of Canadian citizens. We must listen carefully and consult with sex trade workers, past and current sex trade workers, while we're creating laws that affect their lives, literally affect their lives. New Zealand engaged in a consultative decriminalization process, listening carefully to current and former sex trade workers, and new laws were enacted in 2003. And an example of what that means for the whole community is this. Last month, a sex worker in New Zealand won a court case, a sexual harassment court case against her boss, who happened to be a brothel owner where she worked. The message that that sends the wider community is very different. It's a message of safety. It's a powerful human honoring message. And it's a message that says that every single person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, no exceptions. How reassuring do you think that court ruling must have been to the waitress or the teacher down the street? Because the safety and wellness of sex workers mirrors, I believe, the safety and wellness and the state of human rights in our entire community, I would say that the development of peer-to-peer, sex worker-led advocacy groups in Canada, like Peers, and like other groups like Peers across Canada, is probably the single most important social justice development of the past 25 years. Our well-being is intimately bound up with each other, and we cannot selectively apply human rights and think that that's going to be okay. Thank you.